A very warm welcome for this monthly lecture, the last monthly lecture of the year 2019. Unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, we are coming closer to Christmas, to the end of the year. So the last highlight of the events at IWM for this year, not the very last event, but let's call it the last highlight, the last monthly lecture for this year. I'm Ludger Hagedorn, working as a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences. I'm happy to welcome you all for this event tonight. I do so on behalf of the IWM, the Institute for Human Sciences, and I also do so on behalf of our rector, Shalini Randeria, who will hopefully join us a bit later tonight as well. We are very happy tonight to have Laura Engelstein as the speaker of this monthly lecture. Laura was and still is, for a very short moment, only for a week or so, was and still is a fellow at the IWM. And this is also a good opportunity to say, Laura, how great it was and still is to have you here, to have you as a fellow, as a colleague at the Institute, to have all the debates with you over lunch and to have you around for so many lectures and to have these discussions and talks with you. And this is, I think, what makes up the atmosphere of the Institute, and you contributed to it significantly over the last 4 months, and it was a pleasure. Having said that, let me very shortly introduce Laura. She is a professor emerita of history from Yale University. In fact, you have these long titles at the American universities always. The Henry S. McNeil Professor of Russian History at Yale University. You worked there from 2002 to 2014 in that position for a long time. You were also chair of the department at Yale University. And before that, from 85 till 2002, you were professor of history at Princeton University. So 2 very long-term professorships at 2 of the most renowned American universities. From your very many publications, Laura, I will just mention, forgive me for that, forgive me for being brief on that, but it's in fact saving time for you, for your talk. I will just mention two of the most recent ones. First, Russia in Flames, War, Revolution, Civil War, 1914 to 1921, a book that came out with Oxford University Press, and in fact you see it on display here. It came out in 2018, a paperback version of it also in 2019. When having a look into the book, as I did this afternoon, I have to admit it was not more than that, but that's what I did. One of the things that really came to mind is how meticulously it is researched and worked out, and also how very nicely and brilliantly it is written. And one of the commentators in the endorsement says it will very soon become a standard volume in English language on that period of time. Secondly, a book, the title of which is The Resistible Rise of Anti-Semitism, Exemplary Cases from Russia, Ukraine and Poland, a book that is meant to come out next year, 2020. And if hearing the title, you can already tell that it has a very close interconnection with the talk of tonight. And for the moment, I leave out the other book that you have on display there, and I'll say a few words on that later on. From the very many awards and fellowships that Laura had, I will also mention very few ones. She was a fellow at the American Academy in Berlin in 2010. She also is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences since 2012, member, and a corresponding fellow of the British Academy since 2016. The title of the talk you have here, Anti-Semitism Resisted and Denied, and it is a portrayal of anti-Semitism in 3 different Eastern European countries and 3 moments in the history of 20th century anti-Semitism. The first moment is the tsarist empire, tsarist Russian empire, the second Ukraine and in relation to the independence movement in Ukraine, and the third is the Polish case that you mentioned, and especially you refer to a writer, Andrzej Bobkowski, on whom you published the other issue, the other volume that is out there on display. And when also reading into this this afternoon, I found something very nice that maybe nicely characterizes the book. And I will just read this out to you as a last quote from this book, because I think it is a very, remarkable edition of a writer that I have to admit was totally unknown to me. And what you write in your book, also in your introduction, is that he was widely unknown to almost everybody for a very long time, and only had a very little of a reception in post-war Poland after the Second World War. It's diaries from him living in France between 1940 and 1944. And a very close following of the happenings of that time. And Bobkowski himself said, this is, I find, a very remarkable sentence. He said, it was the perfect position to be at that time, and he describes Paris as the perfect armchair. So also not a very usual thing, Paris as the perfect armchair at that time to observe the events of that time. And I have this one very short final quote for you. I'll read that, and then I'll hand over to you, Laura. And it describes a train ride. So the writer Bobkowski is on board of that train, and he goes off for a short moment to buy a newspaper at the newsstand. And I will read the 3 or 4 sentences that follow afterwards, and I find they so very nicely describe maybe the atmosphere of that time, but also the tone of this book, the language of this book, the wittiness of this book. So, returning from the newsstand. Returning from the newsstand, I noticed that platforms carrying anti-aircraft weapons are attached to the rear of all trains heading for the coast. We are traveling under armed guard. Small huts have been constructed on the platforms für die Mannschaft. So it's German soldiers. The soldiers are cooking, drying their linens. A Frenchman passes me and asks how I like this traveling circus. I answer that I'd prefer a real circus with real monkeys. We start up. The weather gets worse. That much. Laura, the floor is yours.
Oops. Okay, it's okay. Put my watch out. Well, thank you so much for this introduction. And I want to thank even people not in this room for having invited me here. It's been an absolutely wonderful 2.5 months. It's been hospitable, it's been warm, it's been interesting, it's been intellectually challenging. I've had many interesting and informal conversations, and it's a really wonderful mix of people from different places, different points in their careers, different specialties, and it's really been a real treat to be here. I will thank Ludger for the introduction. You stole a little bit of my thunder, but okay. And I just want to make clear, I didn't write that book. I translated it. Just, yeah. It was, yes. The topic of my lecture today, unfortunately, seems never to go out of fashion, anti-Semitism. But what do we mean by this word, and what do I mean by it in the course of this lecture? This is a lecture, as Ludger pointed out, that's based on this forthcoming book. So it gives you basically the argument and structure of the book. So we know that hostility to the Jews goes way back in Western history, and anti-Jewish violence has very deep roots. The term itself, anti-Semitism, as probably most people in this room know, was coined only in 1879 in the context of emerging German nationalism, post-unification German nationalism. So the term itself is modern. It designates, at the center of this idea, anti-Semitism, is a belief system centered on the myth of a sinister network identified with a power known as the Jews, that controls the world and has to be resisted. And this vision itself seems archaic, but in fact it too is modern, and it was codified in the notorious Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which it was published only at the beginning of the 20th century. Anti-Semitism has functioned in the modern political arena, not as a vestige left over from a primitive age, but as an instrument of populist mobilization. So I'm interested in anti-Semitism as a political instrument in the modern age. It was used as an ideology and a war cry in maintaining the power of empires that were failing, and also often in shaping the national movements that were challenging these same empires. And of course, it was most infamous as the core of the ideology of National Socialism. In the decades following World War II, the Holocaust made anti-Semitism disreputable. So official postures and acceptable public discourse were obliged to conform to some norms established by international consensus. The taboo was violated, but it was nevertheless felt. This consensus was hard-won and fragile. And as everyone here knows, the impact of the Holocaust was not instantaneous. It took quite a while after the war, despite the massive evidence for revelations about the extermination of the Jews and the culpability of their executioners, to affect public awareness. Bringing the past to light and changing the moral equation took a massive effort that had constantly to be renewed. And today, indeed, we worry that anti-Semitism is making a comeback. Read the New York Times, read any newspaper, the latest news, anti-Semitism is in the headlines. So in the political arena, anti-Semitism may seem to be ineradicable, but it has never gotten a free pass. From the very beginning of the 20th century, as anti-Jewish propaganda and anti-Jewish violence assumed ever more virulent forms, they always encountered vigorous opposition. The opposition was organized in the transnational sphere by Jewish activists and their non-Jewish allies. And this was not merely a humanitarian crusade. It was a campaign on behalf of shared political values, using modern methods of political warfare to fight back. So my emphasis, there are other dimensions of anti-Semitism. You can talk about culture, psychology, lots of things. But my emphasis in this discussion is on anti-Semitism as a political weapon. And the lecture today, as well as the book that's forthcoming, explores three 20th century moments that are linked by a common theme. In different ways and in distinct but interrelated settings, they illustrate the process by which anti-Semitism became the object of moral censure and the ways in which the proponents of anti-Semitism were compelled to adapt. And this fight over anti-Semitism was not just about the Jews, real or imagined. In 19th century Europe, as Shulamit Volkov has pointed out, anti-Semitism functioned as what she calls a cultural code. It distinguished its bearers from proponents of an opposing political model. And this opposing political model was the project of liberal citizenship, to which the demand for Jewish rights, Jewish emancipation as it was called, was attached. And the anti-Semitic backlash was a reaction to the model itself. The transnational Jewish mobilization in the 19th and early 20th centuries fought for Jewish rights and the liberal principles on which these rights depended. Its efforts enjoyed considerable success, despite their obvious limitations. Anti-Semitism acquired a stigma, but the stigma, in turn, led to camouflage and denial. So that's where my title comes from. With reference to Poland, sociologist Johanna Miklich calls this posture anti-Semitism without anti-Semites. So that's where I first encountered this phrase. In fact, this very useful phrase is originated by our own Bernd Marin in a 1979 article, which he very nicely passed on to me. And he's writing here with respect to post-war Austria. And there he identifies a pattern in which the taboo on anti-Semitic ideology did not so much eradicate anti-Semitism as obscure, cover over, pervasive attitudes that remained usually unacknowledged and uncensured. So either knowingly or not knowingly, all the stereotypes and the feelings associated with anti-Semitism persist, although you can't say them out loud in the public arena anymore. So the three cases I'm talking about today illustrate variations on this theme. Two of them from an earlier period, and the third one goes into the Second War and the post-war, Second War. So in addition to anti-Semitism being modern, the Jews themselves were modern, at least as far as Russia was concerned. They enter the Russian Empire only at the end of the 18th century. And here we get, okay, my first illustration. illustration. With the partition, the Polish partitions at the end of the 18th century. A century after that, the number of Jews in the entire Russian Empire was approximately 5 million. From the overall population of the empire, they accounted for about 4%, but in the Pale of Settlement, they were about 10% of the population, and in some of these cities, they were a third or more of the inhabitants. So they were very concentrated, unwillingly, in this area. The Pale of Settlement in Russian is Черта оседлости. So for those of you who are hearing it, will recognize it. And this pale, as you see, encompassed the western provinces, including the Russian-ruled section of Poland, where the Jews were obliged by law to reside. They were also limited by law to certain occupations and to access to educational institutions. But there were enough legal loopholes to allow a significant number of educated Jews to enter mainstream culture and some of its institutions. And these exceptions constituted a Russian Jewish and Polish Jewish cultural elite that contributed to the ethnically hybrid cultural and professional life of the late empire. So this Pale of Settlement was notorious. It had an international reputation. Another feature of Jewish life in the Russian Empire was also notorious, the so-called pogroms. Pogrom is a Russian word that stems from the idea of smashing, but it became, this particular form of the word became associated with, in the international vocabulary indeed, with a distinctive pattern of violence, which is to say peacetime assaults on Jewish settlements involving humiliation, pillage, destruction, rape. Rape was ubiquitous when it came to pogroms, and wanton murder. Pogroms were not, however, everyday events. They occurred at moments of political and social crisis. So they peaked in 1881 after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, and his reign goes under the heading, "No good deed goes unpunished," because of course he was the Tsar who liberated the serfs. He was assassinated in 1881. In 1903, during an economic downturn, and in connection with the 1905 revolution. The pogroms were technically illegal as a form of mob violence, and they were never authorized by the Tsar at the highest peak of power, but they were encouraged by the compliance of the authorities, by the general tenor of official policy, and after 1905 by officially sanctioned pro-monarchist organizations. And this whole period is a period of fermentation in Imperial Russian society. And the revolution of 1905, which is associated in most people's minds with radicalism, socialism, and the Soviets, which emerged for the first time, was actually initiated by the educated urban classes and some of the landed elites, and their goal was constitutional reform, not socialism or any of the radical ideology on the left-wing fringe. And this indeed is what the revolution produced. And it was in this context that Jewish spokesmen pursued the cause of Jewish rights, first as part of the oppositional liberal movement, then as participants in the revolution, later in the context of legal political parties, and in the State Duma, which is the parliament that was created as a result of the 1905 revolution. These years were the crucible of Jewish civic mobilization. And why did the pogroms generate international outrage? Partly because these activists publicized the results. And here's what I'm talking about, modern methods of pushing back against anti-Semitism. They collected evidence. They recorded witness testimonies. They sent agents into the field. They photographed corpses. And here we see these kind of photographs were taken by Jewish agents sent into the field to document the damage that had been inflicted on the Jewish population. Jewish lawyers were very active in this whole movement, and they had Gentile colleagues. They appeared in courtrooms on behalf of Jewish victims. They mounted the defense of Mendel Beilis, the Beilis case of 1911 and 1913, when this poor, miserable Jewish, I can't remember what he was, a bricklayer or something, was accused of blood libel in a trial that was orchestrated by the Ministry of Justice. Their efforts were backed by funds and publicity supplied by the organized Jewish diaspora. So you have internal organization emerging inside the Russian intelligentsia, Russian Jewish intelligentsia, which is connected worldwide to various Jewish organizations which begin to pop up in this period across the the northern hemisphere, so to speak, in the United States and Western Europe. And so here we have, these are the pogroms and the kind of testimony they collect. And here we have examples of the kind of figures who were involved in the liberal movement, in the liberal cadet party, and also in the fight to secure Jewish rights and to push back against anti-Semitism. So Maxim Winawer was born in Warsaw. He was Polish originally, but he moved to St. Petersburg and made himself a Russian career as a lawyer. He went as far as he was allowed to go as a Jew in the legal establishment. And he was really the mastermind of this campaign, and he was a real institution builder and so on. The middle guy is fascinating to me, Vasily Maklakov. He came from an aristocratic family. His brother was at the same time the arch-reactionary minister of the Interior, partly responsible for the Beilis trial. And his brother was actually assassinated, or executed, I should say, by the Bolsheviks in 1918. Maklakov was appointed ambassador to Paris by the provisional government, which is where the Bolshevik coup caught him. He took all the papers and sent them to Columbia University, where they now reside. Anyway, he's very interesting. He was the most conservative of the cadets. He was a really smart guy. He was totally devoted to the Jewish issue. No particular personal reason to be so whatsoever. This is a guy whose name you will recognize. This is the father of the future novelist. The future novelist was born in 1899, so he wasn't doing much at this point. He was also from extremely wealthy, prominent, aristocratic family. The grandfather had been Alexander II's Minister of Justice. So they were a very enlightened aristocratic family. And if you read the sentence from Vladimir Nabokov, the novelist's memoir, some aunt of his said to Vladimir Dmitrievich, the father, he said, you know, with what you're up to, you're destroying the life that you enjoy so much. And it's true. He was helping to undermine the kind of class hierarchy, the kind of social system of which he disapproved. And he had really an exemplary record on all these kind of questions of liberal politics and Jewish rights. So war, 1914, 1905 is revolution, 1914 is war. I'm jumping across the landmarks of history here. War is a prime time for xenophobic propaganda. It was common to all sides in the First World War, xenophobia in general, anti-Semitism in particular. Russian authorities were particularly nervous. The western provinces of the Pale that we saw were populated by Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews. All of them had brethren on the other side of the borders. The empire's Polish subjects were notorious for their 19th century rebellions. Ethnic Poles fought in the enemy's armies. The Jews spoke a Germanic language, Yiddish. Official distrust of the Jews long antedated the war, but during the war, the army high command was so obsessed with Jewish treachery that it expelled all the Jews from those western provinces into the interior. And this policy was entirely counterproductive. The Council of Ministers were appalled. The flood of refugees that it produced increased the internal fragmentation of the empire and deepened the social crisis that was already being created by the war. So in short, anti-Semitism, which was used by the regime as a way to bolster the monarchy in moments of fading authority, ended by hastening its demise. And so this is a nice sort of ironic moment in pre-demise Russian history. World War I, as we all know, leads to revolution in 1917. And in the beginning, the revolution changed the picture considerably for the Jews with mixed results. In February, the liberal project seemed to have triumphed, and with it the case for the Jews. The provisional government grants equal rights to all minorities and religious groups, including the Jews, but the coup in October ends the liberal hopes and gives rise to a brutal and multi-sided civil war. So in the end, you have a polarization, two forms of authoritarianism face-to-face, white versus red. Anti-Semitism, however, straddled the political spectrum and the class divide. So the whites, the anti-Bolsheviks, blamed the Jews for the revolution, and their favorite symbol of this was, of course, Leon Trotsky, who was born Bernstein. Nationalist leaders struggling to escape Russian domination blamed the Jews for Soviet aggression. At the grassroots level, you had anti-Semitism was deployed by there were many charismatic leaders, these chieftains, atamani, who created these self-mobilizing peasant outfits that fought on all sides of the Civil War. And the Red Army itself was not immune to pogroms, as many of you probably know. The Red Cavalry was the worst offender. The language of anti-Bolshevik backlash became the signature even of disenchanted Bolshevik followers. So down with the Yid commissars became the battle cry of disappointed workers and angry peasants when they became unhappy with the Bolshevik control of an area or with various Bolshevik policies. So this was a kind of a ubiquitous language during the Civil War. In the course of this complicated conflict, Jews were caught in the maelstrom. And I mean Jews, not political Jews, I mean the Jews living still in the territory of the old Pale of Settlement. And it has been estimated by people counting at the time and by scholars thinking about it later that at least 60,000, if not twice that number, of Jews were murdered in the course of an enormous pogrom wave that swept the Western territories in 1919 and 20. Perhaps as many as 300,000 were dispossessed and injured and damaged in various ways. So mention of the Civil War pogroms, and the emergence of national movements brings us to the second case. So the first case is Russia, the liberal movement, fighting against official anti-Semitism and its various uses in the Civil War. And here in every case I'm simplifying greatly for the sake of giving you a kind of overall picture. So this mention of these things brings us to the second case, which is this case of Symon Petlyura. And here I have to say this is my favorite slide of any, and I found it in the Slavonic Library in Prague, this one here. It's the Ukrainian view of what was happening to Ukraine during the Civil War. Everyone wants a peace, everyone is invaded. Ukraine is the object of desire, so to speak, of outside forces and of competing forces within the empire. And this is a portrait of Symon Petlyura. He belongs to a period of Ukrainian history, this period that is both troubling and ambivalent. It was also the founding moment of what later becomes, after the long hiatus of Soviet rule, today's independent Ukraine. And the Ukrainian story begins in very similar way to the story of the other peripheral areas. In each of these areas, the local elites take the opportunity, when the monarchy fails, to make a bid for national independence. And this idea of national independence had been kind of bubbling along in the late 19th century and becoming more articulate during the First World War, and then really after 1917 starts really to take practical form. After the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, the Central Powers occupy the territory that had been briefly claimed by Ukrainian nationalist spokesmen. And once the Germans left, Petlyura became first one of two leaders and then shortly the sole head of a self-declared independent Ukrainian state, the Ukrainian National Republic or People's Republic, depending on how you translate the Narodovo. People, but it also has an implication of national, narod, narud. You know, that it has in Russia, in all these languages, it has this kind of penumbra of meaning. And actually, Petlyura identified as a socialist. So there is this folkish, not in the Nazi sense, but in the folkish sense of what the project of this new state was supposed to be. Now, this is the story of Ukraine in the Civil War is maximum complicated. I'm going to make a long and complicated story very, very, very short, and everybody can attack me afterward on what I've left out or missed or distorted. There's one historian who wrote a history of Ukraine in the Civil War, and his introduction says, in English language history, it says, I know this story was so complicated, I've made many mistakes. Go ahead and criticize, I did the best I could. So in that spirit in which I deal with Ukraine in the Civil War. Okay, long and the short of it, Ukraine is assailed from all sides. Reds, whites, state-building Poles, each one was determined to assert control over all or part of this sprawling but crucial territory. And this is the terrain that included the territory of the now defunct Pale of Settlement, which was swept away actually first de facto during the war and then de jure by the provisional government. All the contending armies and semi-armies that moved back and forth across it drew from the same peasant population, and when it came to pogroms, no one's hands were clean. But the formal and informal forces fighting in Petlyura's name were the leading culprits, numerically and in terms of the intensity of the violence. Okay, skip a little forward. In 1920, the situation worsens. Petlyura and his cabinet retreat first to Poland and then to Paris. And there they constitute themselves a government in exile. By 1921, the Bolsheviks, now communists, have taken control of Ukraine by a combination of military force and political manipulation, and created the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Petlyura was therefore a founding father, but a defeated founding father. The largely powerless and symbolically very important government that he had led was moreover associated with the greatest number of the most brutal pogroms of the Civil War era. So, in addition to being a political failure, was he also an anti-Semite? Some people thought so. On May 25th, 1926, as many of you in this room will know, most of you probably at the EVM, Petlyura was assassinated in broad daylight on a Parisian street by another refugee from Ukraine, a Jewish watchmaker by the name of Symon Petlyura. This is for the pogroms he's announced, and he was instantly arrested. So the focus of the story here is on the trial. At this point, Schwarzbart had arrived in France in 1910. He had fought in the Foreign Legion. He returned to Russia in 1917. His family had been murdered in the pogroms of the Civil War. He came back to France. He became a French citizen. In 1926, he assassinates Petlyura. His trial takes place in October 1927. His guilt was obvious. The trial revolved instead around the question of the murder victim's reputation. So this, in a sense, was a trial of the person who was the victim of the crime rather than the perpetrator of the crime. And the question was he justified in thinking that the former leader of the short-lived Ukrainian Republic had been responsible for the pogroms which killed his family? Was it a crime of passion? Was he acting under the emotion of knowing that this was the man who had been responsible for his family's fate? In this courtroom, the remaining members of the UNR cabinet, the Ukrainian cabinet, faced off against representatives of the same Jewish organizations which had documented the pogroms, had gathered testimony, had, during the Civil War, had themselves gone into exile from the Soviet regime and taken their archives with them, and continued to pursue the same strategy of exposure and publicity. These were also the activists who had showed up in Paris in 1919, arguing for protection for minority populations in the new nations that were emerging after the First World War. And their archives are now housed in YIVO in New York City, in an institution that they themselves founded. Not all Jewish leaders liked the strategy of defending an assassin and making him, in some sense, symbolic of the Jewish nation, especially since, and here is the most interesting part of this trial from my point of view, the beginning of the 20th century, we have the Dreyfus case, we have the Bayless case. In both of those trials, they were militant anti-Semites who were never apologizing for their position. They were sure they were right. And their opponents were defending someone who was accused of a crime he hadn't committed. In this case, the defendant had committed the crime, and everyone in the courtyard, in the courtroom, agreed. Anti-Semitism was not a good thing. The entire posthumous defense of Petlyura consisted in the assertion that, no, he had not been an anti-Semite. He had in fact opposed the pogroms, and indeed, he had never used anti-Semitism as a mobilizing ideology. He had in fact made various attempts, if unsuccessful, to curb the violence of his own forces. And he did so partly, obviously, out of personal conviction, but also in the interest of the Ukrainian cause. He had sent representatives to the United States to influence American public opinion. This is while the Civil War is going on. They had insisted and noted that Jews had participated in the UNR government, which was true, which officially had denounced the pogroms and to some extent aided its victims. But Petlyura could not escape his association with the doings of the various armed outfits, not to speak of his own army, whose commanders, and this is the level below Petlyura, had explicitly called for the slaughter of the Jews on behalf of the cause that Petlyura represented. So he's kind of caught in this terrible situation. Therefore, the defenders, his posthumous defenders, he is not there obviously, insisted on his powerlessness, on his inability to stop this. So how can you hold him responsible? But at the same time, they insisted on his political importance. He stood for Ukraine. Schwarzbart defense also made Petlyura into a symbol. They insisted this was not a symbol of Ukraine, but a symbol of anti-Semitism itself. So this was an abstract idea that they were arguing against. The trial for them was an occasion to enlighten the world about the plight of the Jews and warn that anti-Semitism could not be used as a political instrument without political repercussions. So what happened? The Paris jury exonerated Schwarzbart. It accepted that it was plausible for him to think that Petlyura was responsible for what had happened to his family. The Ukrainians, however, ended the trial. They were not happy with this outcome. They ended the trial by denouncing Schwarzbart as a tool of Soviet imperialism. Once again, they charged the Jews were helping Moscow, now Bolshevik, to subjugate Ukraine, this time by removing its last remaining national leader. In addition, they denounced the international Jewish networks that had ganged up in Paris to blacken the name of Ukraine in the face of international public opinion. They all denied that they were anti-Semites, and they sincerely believed it, and in many respects, they were telling the truth. But this is this funny relationship between anti-Semitic convictions or attitudes or stereotypes and the necessity in certain situations to deny, to reject, to repudiate them. The Ukrainian paradox takes us to the problem of the Polish nation, also a product of the collapse of empires following the First World War. In November 1918, after again a short but complicated interregnum, Józef Piłsudski becomes head of state of a newborn Polish republic. And as everyone in this room knows for sure, there were two visions of the future Polish nation that were competing with each other: the Piłsudski vision of a larger ethnically composite nation, and Moski's vision of an ethnocentric Polish nation, which should be exclusively Polish in language, culture, and Catholic religion. And here's a case, Moski in the Polish case, and there are also plenty of examples in the Russian case, of anti-Semites who never apologized, who never denied it, who were proud of it, who stuck to their convictions to the end of their days, in his case till 1939. Not all Poles, it goes without saying, should go without saying, accepted the platform of the National Democratic Party, his party, but unabashed anti-Semitism was woven into the fabric of post-1918 Polish nationalism. And when the 1919 Paris Peace Conference imposes the minority rights treaties on the various nations, the Polish leaders really deeply resented this as an infringement on their sovereignty, and as soon as they could, in 1934, they repudiated the treaty. They spent the interwar years trying to find ways to get rid of the Jewish population from Poland. This is the environment, I know it's a long excursion to get to Bobkowski, in which our protagonist, the writer Andrzej Bobkowski, spent his formative years. Now, Andrzej Bobkowski was Polish. He was neither born nor died in Poland. He was born in Wiener Neustadt, which was at the time, still is, I think, in Austria, because some places changed, this one didn't. His father was a general in the Austrian army. His Polish father was a general, an officer in the Austrian army attached to a military academy in Wiener Neustadt. But he was raised in Warsaw. He attended the higher school of economics. But he was a maverick, and in March 1939, he and his new wife left Poland for France. Their plan was to keep going to Buenos Aires, where he wanted to find work for the commercial section of the Polish embassy. He was sort of the model of Joseph Conrad. Get up, get on a ship, go somewhere, see the world. History overtook the couple in September 1939, and they were obliged to remain in France for the rest of the war. And Bobkowski gets a position with an armaments factory near Paris that employed Polish workers. In June 1940, however, France falls to the Germans. Paris is occupied, and much of the population flees to the so-called free zone in the south. The Polish armaments workers were evacuated, and Bobkowski goes along with them. So this is where the fun part of the Bobkowski story starts. He had an idea of earning a living as an embassy official, but his real ambition was literary. So he accompanies the workers down to the south of France, and then his wife is still in Paris minding their apartment. He decides to go back, and he decides to go back on a bicycle. And apparently, in real life, he went back with a couple of buddies, but in the stripped-down version of his journals, there's only one guy represents his companions. He goes back to Paris along a circuitous route, skirting German patrols, following the Riviera, having a good old time, drinking wine, cheese, berries off the tree, and so on, enjoying the countryside. And he keeps a journal the whole time in which he noted his observations of daily life. And these were daily life under conditions of wartime, very far away from the actual war. He gets back to occupied Paris, and he's still attached to the factory, and there's a vestigial staff, and he continues to record details of the world around him. Not so joyous this time, since he's in occupied Paris. He's fluent in French and German. He has a very good European education. He follows the occupation press. He listens to broadcasts from the government in exile in London. So the Polish government in exile broadcasts back to Europe on the BBC wavelength, and everyone is listening. He trades on the black market. He does, underhand deals. And he worries about the fate of Poland and the future of post-war Europe, with the Soviet Union looming ever larger in the East. Bobkowski, who at this point is 26 years old or something, 27, thinks of himself as a free man, an individualist who rejects the ideologies at both ends of the spectrum. He calls himself a cosmopole, a cosmopolak. He mocks the heroic postures of Polish nationalism. He denounces Nazism and communism. They're the same two forms of a dehumanizing process that's undermining the humanistic values of European culture. He calls himself a hooligan of freedom, hooligan wolności, someone who flouts convention and challenges received ideas. So, August 1944, Paris is liberated. Bobkowski ends his wartime journal. In 1947, the communists established the Polish People's Republic, and Bobkowski, needless to say, does not return. In Paris, instead, he attaches himself to Kultura. And Kultura was a newly created Polish language publishing house established by a journalist named Jerzy Giedroyć. And the purpose of Kultura was to provide a forum outside of Poland for the free development of Polish thought and literature, a bridge between homeland and immigration that was supposed to sustain the potential for a future democratic Poland. And in the 1950s, shortly after the first decade, more or less 10 years after the end of the war, Kultura gets very interested in the resurgence of anti-Semitism back in Poland and takes a very clearly articulated stand against it. Bobkowski was no longer there. In 1948, he despairs of Europe that's shattered by the war and subject now in the East to Soviet domination. And he and his wife resume the voyage that had been interrupted in 1939. And where do they head? They don't start for Buenos Aires. They head for Guatemala. Not clear why exactly. They didn't know any Spanish. They didn't have any money. But it seems to be that Bobkowski was so disgusted with the degenerate condition of European civilization that he wanted someplace really primitive. So they ended up in Guatemala. And there he ekes out a living and prepares the journal for publication. Now, these journals, which were written in little notebooks during the war, appear under the Kultura imprint 10 years later in 1957, so almost 9 years after he emigrates, under the title Szkice Piórkiem, which literally means pen sketches. And when we, in our lack of wisdom, set out to translate this very large book, we called it Wartime Journals. It's now available in English. He died in Guatemala in 1961. He wasn't yet 50 years old, having, in his understanding of freedom from convention, drunk and smoked himself probably to death prematurely. His wife died in Guatemala 20 years later, at which point she donated the original copybooks to an archive in New York City. Now, one of the nice ironies of this whole situation is that archive is on 30th Street, and the YIVO is on 15th Street, so that the YIVO archive and the Bobkowski archives are more or less 15 blocks away from each other in Manhattan in New York. The afterlife of archives. No one ever heard of Bobkowski, as Luder said. It was only in the 1980s, as things start to loosen up, that a few critics began to recognize his talent. He had published little fragments here and there, and people responded to it. But it took the fall of communism for readers inside Poland to discover the text, and along with it, a literary hero. I should be showing you Bobkowski while I'm talking about him. So this is his library card while he was in Paris. He was an omnivorous reader in every language except Russian. He claimed he hated Russian, he hated the Russians, but he actually knew Russian. And here he is in Guatemala, typing up the revised version of the notebooks. So that's Bobkowski. And he was a young man, but to my mind, he never looked young. He had this kind of this kind of prematurely sort of serious, I don't know, there's something funny about him. But this tone of, he had a sense of humor, he had a wit, as Lidger figured out, and so there's this playful quality that people start responding to when they start reading it, the text. So the Polish readers in Poland discovered this new voice and a kind of new hero. He seemed to have escaped all the traps of 20th century politics and culture. He was skeptical of rah-rah patriotism, he was hostile to communism, he was critical of capitalism, he had a refreshingly casual prose style. Fan clubs sprang up. Cyclists repeated his tour of France by bicycle. His biography was posted online. The centenary of his birth was celebrated in 2013 online and offline. In his notes, he had adopted this anti-heroic posture. No sentimental invocations of Polish victories or defeats for this young fellow on a bike. He rejected his father, the general in the Polish Austrian army. But here he was, a hero. Until an industrious Polish graduate student named Łukasz Mikołajewski, who was studying at the time in the European University in Florence, decided to go to New York and take a look at the archives. He wanted to discover what, if anything, and if so, how much, Bobkowski had altered between the handwritten copybooks and the 1957 Kultura edition, from which we use here as the basis of translation. Some of his views, it turned out, had been slightly adjusted: communism, the United States, mass culture, blah, blah. But there was one respect in which Bobkowski had diverged significantly from what he had written at the time. Guess on what subject? The text, as published in 1957, had very little to say about the situation of the Jews during the war, despite the fact that there were plenty of Jews in Paris, and most of whom were Polish. But he wasn't interested, and on every street corner there was a sign saying interdit to juif, and so on and so forth, but this did not capture his attention. The 1957 edition made clear, however, that he knew what was happening to the Jews in the East, and he knew what was happening to them in Paris. You couldn't escape the Vélodrome d'hiver, the roundups of the Jews in Paris. Everyone knew about that, although he managed to ignore the bombing of synagogues, so he was somewhat selective. This 1957 edition took pains also to repudiate anti-Semitism very explicitly as the reason for the Jews' persecution. In the intimacy of his copybooks, by contrast, he had indulged in the crudest of anti-Semitic cliches. He subscribed to a network, the idea of a Jewish network controlling the actions of the Western powers, which had forced Poland to act against its own best interest. He looked forward to a post-war Poland free of the Jews, and so on. In editing the manuscript for publication, he had eliminated all those passages and added passages that suggested that he had been conscious of anti-Semitism as a problem even at that time. And there is no record of why he did this. So it's a really interesting case. There is a phrase in one of the letters he sent to Giedroyć in 1949 in which he asks him, "Do you know a way to convince the Jews that one is not an anti-Semite?" This is the problem of anti-Semites. They have to convince you you're not one. And this was not a sign of contrition. This was a grievance. And why was it a grievance? The Jews around him in Guatemala, he complained, considered Poles no better than Nazis. And he was personally offended by this. He was indignant on his own behalf. And he reminds Giedroyć that at some point during the war in Paris, to occupy Paris, a Jewish woman had turned up who had been a school friend of his wife's back in Poland, and he needed to do something to help her, and he did. And it wasn't that good of him. And this incident shows up in the 1957 version. In the copybooks, he says, you know, I was really disgusted when she showed up. I helped her, but it was really against it made me shudder, because more and more I hate the Jews, that cursed tribe of Judas. So in his real expression of his feeling at the time, he does it, but he experiences repulsion while he's doing it. So let us turn, as I approach the conclusion, to the question of camouflage and opportunism. So the liberal cadets were desperately searching for allies at the end. I'm going back over the three cases here briefly. During the Civil War, to find allies. Everything had really come down to whites versus reds. And they turned to the whites as their only hope for a non-Bolshevik future. And they urged the white generals to make a gesture and repudiate the anti-Semitism that was rife in the volunteer army and among the generals and in general in their movement, in order to stay in the good graces of the Western powers. So a completely opportunistic reason. The whites believed the Jews could exercise considerable influence behind the scenes among the Western powers and disposed of considerable financial resources which perhaps they could take advantage of. But they refused to follow this advice. They were shamelessly consistent. So the whites do not apologize, they do not make gestures, they don't do anything to move away from that position. Petlyura contrasts with this. On the one hand, first of all, personally, he was not an anti-Semite. He knew during the war that pogroms were doing damage to the Ukrainian cause. Sometimes he insisted his troops were blameless. Sometimes he had to acknowledge what they were doing, and he blamed it on outside agitators, mostly on Bolsheviks. He also spoke of the Jews as part of the Ukrainian nation, as victims, not perpetrators of communist violence. But there was no way to deny that Ukrainian fighters were involved in pogroms. He condemned them, but his gestures were not very productive. They convinced neither his followers nor his detractors. In the Polish case, the government in exile, the underground in Poland, and the Polish army formed by General Anders in the Soviet Union in 1941 were all urged by their allied backers to make a good impression when it came to the Jews. They resented the interference and they minimized the concessions that they were willing to make. So this whole attitude is really ubiquitous, especially in the Polish case during the war. Bobkowski was not a political figure, and times had changed. It is not clear why he decided he had to suppress the opinions he had held at the time. Did he understand that 10 years after the war, the enormity of the Holocaust, although not yet fully acknowledged, made it impossible to maintain the old tone? Was it simply that Giedroyc would not have published that kind of language in his journals? But there is a bright side to the story of Bobkowski. And the bright side has to do with the scandal of the revelation of his original copybooks. Once Mikołajewski published his archival findings, an impassioned debate broke out in the Polish intellectual arena. This champion of freedom, this champion of the value of the individual human being, the debunker of chauvinist patriotism, the nonconformist who resisted every cliche, this ideal Bobkowski had fallen for the worst cliches and stereotypes of interwar and wartime Poland and European culture. What to make of him? Oh, some said he just was a man of his time. Well, Józef Chapski was also a man of his time and had very different attitudes toward the Jews even then. Others insisted he couldn't be let easily off the hook. You could celebrate his literary talent without reference to his beliefs, perhaps. Look at T.S. Eliot. We still read T.S. Eliot. But it was precisely the attitude of moral earnestness, of moral judgmentalness, that gives his writing its force and at the same time sets him up for a fall. It was dubious to celebrate Bobkowski the person as a cultural hero. But today's Poland is not the Poland of the war or even the immediate post-war. Jan Gross's Neighbors has made a real difference. And the scandal around, among other things, the scandal around Bobkowski illustrates a deep disappointment, particularly among intellectuals of a younger generation, and who refuse to sweep the outtakes under the rug, to confront the hidden and not so hidden transcripts. As everyone in this room knows, and here we come back to the present time, and I will shortly conclude, the present Polish government, in contrast to certain sectors of Polish civil society, replicates the responses of anti-Semites from before and during the war. The charge of anti-Semitism remains an affront and a liability with inconvenient consequences. One must therefore deny it. Evidence of Polish complicity in the Nazi project of extermination on Polish soil must be refuted. Those who insist on the historical evidence, many of whom are presumably Jews, are enemies of the Polish people. And the other current example, of course, is Viktor Orban, who began his career trying to conform his image to the EU standards. And in 2015, launched a campaign to vilify the Hungarian-born Jewish-American financier, George Soros, who, again, to come back to my original statement, Soros has been an active promoter of liberal institutions in post-communist Europe. So this association of liberalism with Jewish rights, with Jews, and this opposition as the foil to anti-Semitism in various modern contexts. So in Hungary, we find posters of a laughing Soros as a hook-nosed predator, which leave no doubt as to the basic message. References to global capitalism drive the point home, and the code doesn't really have to be made explicit. Other examples of this could be cited, not all of them from Eastern Europe. So how to conclude a story of partial defeats and partial successes? When the democratic institutions in the Western nations start to weaken, the opening for revived anti-Semitism expands. Camouflage is still the order of the day, although increasingly the inhibition is weakening. The basic meaning of anti-Semitism as a political as well as a cultural code, nevertheless, is still in place. It still stands for opposition to, anti-Semitism still stands for opposition to the basic principles of liberal democracy, and the institutions based on those principles, which provided the platform on which the Jewish diaspora and its allies were able to wage their campaign against anti-Semitism in the political arena well before the Holocaust demonstrated the full scope of its fatal effects. I'll explain this in a minute. Unfortunately, one could go on forever illustrating this theme, and I just want to give two examples from New York Times of yesterday. One of which is that Ronald S. Lauder is a billionaire cosmetics, how do we say this? A cosmetics billionaire? A billionaire who made his fortune on cosmetics, who has funded really basically almost single-handedly the resurrection, the memorialization of lost culture of Eastern Europe. So in Krakow, in various, that's his mission, to memorialize, to reconstruct, to remember, and so on. He has now announced the formation of a political action group to fund any and all candidates to American elected offices who oppose anti-Semitism. This is his campaign against anti-Semitism. At the same time, he insists that our current president, despite his overt bigotry and his contempt for the US Constitution, is not an anti-Semite, and he gives money to his cause. So here we have someone who doesn't understand this connection. And then on the same page, on the column, the op-ed column, we have Paul Krugman, the economist and political commentator, who reminds the world and his fellow Jews that the survival of democratic institutions, among its other benefits, is the only defense against anti-Semitism that works, even if not entirely and not always. So that's what I have to say on this subject, but before I close, I want to explain this wonderful tiger. This tiger provides the illustration for the cover of my book, and it is the work of a Russian Jewish avant-garde artist, El Zitsky, who is better known for his Soviet poster, Beat the Whites, his Civil War poster, very famous abstract poster. And this is part of a children's book, the title of which is The Hen Who Wanted a Comb in Yiddish. His early career was spent illustrating Yiddish children's books. And it says here, kommt heraus von Wald a Tiger. So out of the woods comes a tiger. And I chose this as the cover of the book because it seems to me it represents a bunch of things: Jewish humor, Jewish aesthetic presence in modernism across Eastern Europe, and ferocity. So this Jewish mobilization, this transnational diasporic mobilization against anti-Semitism, don't mess with us. Don't mess with us. We're going to fight back. And so that's my little mascot for the subject of my book. So thank you for coming and listening.
So thanks. Does it work? No. So thanks, Laura, for, let's say, for the ferocity of your talk. It was really a pleasure to listen. And your talk that was so engaged and instructive, and hope you don't take this as the bad word, also entertaining. It was really, you just have the right speed.
No, I really like it when the audience falls asleep. That's my idea.
You just have the right speed to keep the attention, so it was a big pleasure. Thank you so much for that. And I have the sense that Andrzej Bobkowski might deserve a full evening of his own, or in fact several evenings of his own. But I also understand that this is a story of the past and a project that you have finished. But you very nicely built it into the talk of today, and I'm even more happy now that at the beginning I had this very, very short quote, not knowing where you would go, but I think it gave us a good sense of the tone and the atmosphere of that book, which I liked very much reading into this afternoon. Well, I could start with a question on my own, but this is maybe not what one should do in this position, so I invite you to have your comments, questions. We have enough time towards. Sorry? Very short story to tell. Yes. Yeah,
but with a microphone.
Just let me say one more thing that I forgot, because I remembered during the talk. Also the concept of the Kosmopol in German. The Kosmopol is a very interesting one, and I know there is a German writer of Polish origin who heavily draws on this concept as well, and somehow I don't know. I wouldn't even say that he sells it as his own concept, but it is always a new concept. Like very many Polish writers, I think, have invented this concept anew, and I don't know if Bobkowski is the real inventor of it or if he claims to have invented it. But in any case, it's a very interesting and nice wording for a Pole living in exile. Yeah.
I would say one thing about that, that comment. He meant it to mean on the model of Joseph Conrad that he was bigger than Poland, but also his Polish education as a Pole he was fluent in French and German. He was a European, his education was European, so he was in a sense already, as a Pole, cosmopolitan.
First of all, I have to congratulate you for the translation of the book. This is amazing. I read it in the late 80s. It was in a format a little bit bigger than my smartphone.
Yeah.
Samizdat edition.
Oh yes, right. There was a Samizdat edition.
I could easily squeeze it to my pocket, literally. And I'm also proud to say that Łukasz Mikołajewski is a student of mine, and he diverged the secret that what he had found in the archives. He was perhaps one of the first who to know that story. But the story to entertain you, so to speak, is that I have noticed such an attitude, you know, as his. In the early 90s, I traveled on train with my wife, and there was a educated lady, apparently educated lady, sitting in front of us. And since we are heading for the general election, she warned us at the very beginning to vote for whom? For the ours. For us. And so I asked, who are the us? Everybody knows, not the Jews. And she started the whole story, how the Jews, between the wars, because she used to work in a publishing house between the wars, so she had, you know, she dealt with educated people, and most of them were Jewish. And then she talked on for some 20 minutes, and then I said, I'm not very happy to hear that, because I'm Jewish. And she kept silent for a while. How come? So she asked my wife, have you married a Jew? No, she said, yes, I have. And then she started another story. Incidentally, I'm not Jewish. So she started another story, how clever the Jews were how clever. Yeah. I mean, in the old ambivalence of the word clever, smart and nasty on both sides. So they're so clever. When there was a day of fasting, they never touched the meat. Whereas the Poles were proud to to break the rules, but not the Jews. They were clever. So, but I am pretty sure that such an event wouldn't take place these days. Not because the Poles are less anti-Semitic, but we control ourselves much more than we used to in the early 90s. And there is another division between us and them. Nobody would say the Jews and the Poles. No, this is the present party, the ruling party supporters and the opposition. Now is the primary the division of Polish society, us and them.
Yeah.
No comment?
Well, no, it's a good.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed this. And my question is about, because it seems as though you're interested in something which is at once anti-Semitism, but also a kind of using anti-Semitism as itself a political charge. So charging someone with anti-Semitism at the same time that people are charging people with being Jews or collaborators. So that there's kind of this, there are two parallel political forces that you seem to be interested in. You know, the Petlyura, Schwarzbard instance is one where one has to test whether the anti-Semitism charge matches the person, right? And then, you know, in the Bobkowski case, it's sort of like flipped. But is that what you're interested in? How there are kind of two forces that have come into being that are now like political possibilities to be able to charge someone with anti-Semitism and to be able to charge someone with you know, being a Jewish collaborator, or you know, the standard? Or what you know, what I'm interested in is this matter of things being, it seems to me as though you're intrigued by moments where there's an out of phaseness between the you know, like the historical actors' expectations about people's behavior and their actual behavior. So in the case of Schwarzbard, for example, and Petlyura, there's you describe some kind of misunderstanding. And then in the case of Bobkowski, you describe, you know, someone who sat through the war and then rewrites their memoirs in order to kind of sanitize, but it's not quite clear politically why he's doing that, or at least, and so what is it about these sort of unmoored, I would call them, these unmoored moments where somebody kind of misreads a character, right? Because in both cases it's about a misreading, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, Petlyura case, there's a British historian who has written some very sharp and useful articles on this Petlyura trial and this whole question of Petlyura, and they're called Beyond Petlyura, right? So the fixation on Petlyura is misleading, because if you say Petlyura was not an anti-Semite, as if to exonerate the entire Ukrainian national movement during the Civil War, that's misleading, because many of his lieutenants and acolytes and so on and so forth, and not to speak of the fact that forces with his banner in the name of Petlyura were committing pogroms. So the Schwarzbard team uses this occasion to talk about the problem of anti-Semitism as a political movement, exemplified in the case of Ukrainian nationalism during the Civil War. So they don't exactly say Petlyura himself personally was an anti-Semite. And Petlyura's defenders everyone agrees. He personally was not an anti-Semite. But what does that mean in terms of responsibility for a movement that behaved in this really violent manner and is rightfully associated with this problem? So there's a little bit of a mismatch in the trial. And some Jewish leaders really didn't like this trial as a platform for this. The team that came there said, we're using this occasion to publicize to the world what happened in the Civil War, to make sure it doesn't happen again. So it got a little bit intertwined in not a very clear way. In terms of the Ukrainian national, the UNR during the Civil War, the leadership had a very clear sense that they had to come clean on this subject. Why? Everyone in the Civil War needed outside backing. They need foreign support. They needed to be recognized. You can't be sovereign without international recognition. You can't just do it in your own little corner. And so what's fascinating to me is the idea that anti-Semitism becomes objectionable, even though it has to be said that the Allied powers, there are plenty of anti-Semites in England. There are plenty of anti-Semites in the United States. But the idea that was very deeply rooted in Eastern Europe was that the Allies will not tolerate, and in fact, in the Paris Peace Conference and so on, they did not tolerate on a certain level. Bobkowski is a different case. Bobkowski is a different case. It would be nice to say that Bobkowski evolved, and that as a young man he was taken in and he absorbed and he just parroted it. But he also creates, this is a work of fiction. I mean, it's a work of literature. It's not just a journal. He creates a persona for himself. And the persona is this, although he's a young man, he is really so free in his thinking. He is such a rebel, he is such a maverick, that everything that is conventional and cliche just doesn't stick to him. Now, this is a persona that gets him into trouble, because once it turns out that a lot of things did stick to him, that didn't always stick to other people. And I love to contrast him to Józef Czapski. Józef Czapski published his memoirs of the war right after the war, not 10 years later. And every other page has a figure of some Polish Jewish figure in which Czapski goes out of his way to say, this is a Pole. This distinguished Jew is a Pole. This other distinguished Jew is a Pole. So he was very much aware. And both Czapski and Giedroyć, by the way, worked in the propaganda department of Andrzej's army in the Soviet Union. And Andrzej was absolutely virulent about the Jews. This is the army that's created after the Sikorsky. This is news to everybody, or no? After the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Poles and the Soviets concluded a pact. And the Soviets permitted first they had deported hundreds of thousands of Poles, including many Jews, into the interior of the Soviet Union, thanks to which these Jews survived the Holocaust. In any case, so they allow the creation of a Polish army inside the Soviet Union, which then exits and fights on the side of the Allies. Anders said, I don't want to, some of these deportees were Jewish, and they volunteered for the army for various reasons. They're not really Polish. I don't want them. And he was pressured to take them on. And so he said to his officers, we're doing this now under pressure, but when we're in control, we won't have to do this anymore. So there's this knowledge that this is inconvenient or damaging to the political purposes of whoever's involved, and you have to either camouflage or dodge or in some way accommodate. So I am so fascinated by the way in which this pressure operates to stigmatize. It doesn't stop it, it doesn't eradicate it. It creates a political environment where you can't just do it. You can't just be it, sort of, some people do. So what are the situations in which you can't?
Many more questions.
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you very much for these three very fascinating narratives you explained to us and you told us. And when listening to you, I had the impression that it's a very positive narrative in the end. I mean, it's certainly something that shows us that anti-Semitism is less and less accepted as a political tool by many people. What I was wondering, though, is how you would fit these three separated and rather isolated histories into a more transnational development, whether this is something that is also linked to a more institutionalized way of fighting anti-Semitism, as the League of Anti-Semitism, fighting, or the League Against Anti-Semitism is being organized in the 1920s, as there are some precursors to this league already. You mentioned the Schwarzbach case, and that served as an occasion of this league against anti-Semitism being founded in France, but it certainly had some predecessors. And I was wondering how you would bring these three episodes into a story that is more transnational history of ideas, a history of the idea of anti-Semitism, or of, well, perhaps less philo-Semitism, but rather fighting racism and anti-Semitism, and how this would match these three cases you told us. Thank you very much.
So that's a good question. I think to some extent I kept using the word transnational to refer to the scope of the Jewish mobilization. And in interests of compression and time, I didn't mention in specifics associated with that. But there were Jewish organizations organized by Jewish communities in the United States, in North America altogether, in France, in England, in Germany, in Austria, in this period. Austria. That's my surprise slide. This is a photograph taken by myself from an art exhibit at the Leopold of Modernism, I believe it was. And this is the cover of, as you see, it explains itself. And the four corners of this cross represent various ways in which Jews are being persecuted. So more violently in, what does it say here? There's Russia, there's Poland, there's, I can't read this anymore. Germany. And here are civilized countries, they just spit on them. In other places, they actually beat them and chase them out. So this is, first of all, this is, I mention it because this is another organization that there is an Austrian version of this anti-Semitic mobilization. There's a German version. And more specifically, in terms of the League Against Anti-Semitism and Racism, the part that I left out about the Schwarzbart trial was that this also drew the participation of the French intelligentsia. So one of the themes of the Schwarzbart trial, that this was supposed to be the vindication of France as a symbol of Republican values. Now, let's just not talk about the Dreyfus case, let's not talk about, and so on and so forth, but there were very intellectuals stood up and said, you know, this is the revenge for Dreyfus in a sense. We are going to prove, we are going to vindicate Schwarzbart, we're going to prove we're against anti-Semitism in the interest of equal rights, Jewish rights, and Republican values. So that connection is very explicit in the Schwarzbart trial. And those organizations which emerge in that period persist. Some of them exist to this day. So that is, on the one hand, transnational, and you could say also that anti-Semitism itself is transnational. The texts go back and forth. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is some kind of falsification, fabrication, apparently, of Russian authorship, has made an incredible circuit of the globe. It's still in operation today. So there are a lot of circuits in operation at the same time. I didn't go into details because not enough time. There are also individuals that tie these cases together, and that's another thing. You have to read the book. The same characters who organize in the Russian case against anti-Semitism, Belis, and so on, the pogroms, go into emigration. And Vinaver, for example, ends up in Paris. And he would have been at the Schwarzbart trial, except he died a couple months before it actually happened. And they are the same people. They found a journal in Paris. Again, Jewish rights, and also particular attention to what's happening in the East. There's a Russian Jewish immigrant journalist who covers the Schwarzbart trial, ends up in Paris, stays in Paris during the war, and keeps a journal. His journal ends up in the YIVO archive. And what I do in the chapter on Bobkowski is I compare this journal of a Russian Jewish journalist kept at the same time in the same place with the journal that Bobkowski keeps at the same time at the same place in Paris. What happens to Bielinki? He's also a French citizen, becomes a French citizen just like Schwarzbart. Despite the fact that he's a French citizen, he is arrested in 1943 and he dies in Sobibor. As a result, his diary was never edited for publication. It stayed in the archive. I actually read the original manuscript, and many decades later, it was published. It's in French by a French-Israeli scholar, so you can read his unedited, unexpurgated, unreconstructed diary in comparison to, and you see what he noticed and what he cared about compared to what Bobkowski noticed and cared about. So I have actually threads, people that tie the three cases together in a very interesting way. They're close enough in time and place that you see the same personnel, actually, in all three, overlapping personnel, let me put it that way.
Thank you very much. I think my question also follows up from this discussion. You sort of conceptualized anti-Semitism as a instrument as a political instrument. But I think in your talk as well, there was this idea that is running through very solidly that sort of resistance against anti-Semitism has been a backbone of sort of the liberal promotion of the liberal cause in a way, or ideas, or political movement, whatever you. I was wondering whether in the book you're sort of getting to this as much as you're sort of dealing with anti-Semitism as a political instrument. Are you sort of conceptualizing the mirror of that as a political instrument, contributing to the formulation of the liberal ideas in a way?
So it turns out, thank you. It turns out that in the Russian case, Jewish rights were very central to the liberal movement. So there are a lot of non-Jews who are involved in the fight for Jewish rights because it was so dramatically emblematic of everything that was wrong with the old regime. And the institution of civil rights and equal rights became a kind of emblem of what it was they were aspiring to. So in the Russian case, they are very closely tied. And my point is not that anti-Semitism doesn't also exist in other dimensions and other ways. It's, as I said before, it's cultural, it's psychological, it's this, that, religious, and so on. But here I'm interested in it as a political instrument and the reaction against it as a political platform associated with certain aspirations, with certain values, and so on. So the anti-Semitism functions, in my cases, as a populist kind of rabble-rousing ideology. So the whites use it, not Petlyura personally, but his lieutenants, his movement use it, and it responds to something in the culture. But the other thing you have to remember about the pogroms, even before 1914, 1917, is peasants and Jews lived together in villages more or less happily most of the time, and most of the cases in which you get a sudden spurt of violence against them, there is always some kind of political moment, some kind of crisis in which this is instigated in some sort of way. And there are different kinds of pogroms. The pogroms before 1914 were popular movements. They were encouraged, they were inspired, they were this or that. The pogroms during the First World War were mostly committed by armies, and the story of what happened, the Russian army did in East Galicia is not a pretty story at all. So you have soldiers now doing the same kind of things that the mobs have been doing in your sort of everyday civilian pogroms, so to speak. And the Civil War is a mixture. You have both things. You have armed units committing this kind of violence. You have spontaneous popular participation in this kind of violence. And so in the Civil War, even in the First World War, it's hard to draw a line always between these kind of atrocities and the actual war itself. But I think it's very important. If you think of anti-Semitism as something that has always been there, that's rooted in Christianity, that's rooted in psychology, that has some kind of self and other business that you can never get away from it, the fact of the matter is there has been pushback, there has been a fighting, it's not over. I'm not ending this actually on a positive note particularly. It's never over. It has to keep being fought. But I guess my propaganda line at the end of this is it's still associated with the values of liberal constitutional democracy. That's where Jewish rights and other minority rights and a certain concept of society and government fit. And anti-Semitism as this mobilizing instrument And look what's happening in the United States. Look what's happening in the right-wing parties. This is still used as a kind of identification marker for this style of politics.
So I think, Anna, yeah, I think we can have at least one more. So who wants to have the final question? Anna, here we go.
Thank you. That was great. I guess my question, I mean, probably banal, but how does the founding of Israel sort of figure in this narrative? I mean, I don't understand like exactly where you're going to end this book, but obviously founding of Israel and, you know, Zionism sort of spliced and yet conflated the story. You know, you can be a pro-Zionist anti-Semite, you can be an anti-Zionist who is not an anti-Semite, and so like I wonder, I mean, obviously it complicates the story a bit, so.
Fortunately, there is a chronological end to my story. And I do not wade into the waters of Israel. Obviously, I mean, it can be said that despite the shift that occurs with the creation of Israel and the different themes that now play into anti-Semitism and this problem of anti-Zionism and so on, some of the old themes of anti-Semitism still persist, even without the added dimension of Israel. But the story of this book, the period that I know something about, stops really before that enters the picture. So I'm not going to speculate.
Can I maybe ask for a very short answer, but just as my own question somewhat. You very much stressed in the beginning that it is modern methods that you're portraying to fight anti-Semitism. Well, the very simple question is, modern in what sense? What does it mean? I mean, you clearly showed that it needs evidence, that you need documentation, you need photo cameras, for example, which you might call modern, so you need technical equipment. You also need like a recipient on the other side. So who is going to read or to see or to witness that stories that are documented? So, I don't know, newspapers on the other hand that receive this. And also you very much stress the involvement of, for example, of Jewish lawyers.
Yeah.
So how much of it is a question of law and not only national law, but maybe also international law as a precondition to portray it in the way that you did?
Yeah. So they operate on different fronts. And my idea is they're very, very interested, everyone is actually on both sides, in public opinion and international public opinion. So for example, in the Schwarzbart trial, you can go to the library, if it's a good library, and you find the volume of documents published by the Schwarzbart side, by basically the Alliance, the French organ, I'm missing it right now, the name. And the Ukrainian side has the same volume with other documents. So there's a kind of war of documents. These are published in multiple languages. They're in French, they're in English, they're in German, they're in Ukrainian, they're in the range of, so that different publics can be made aware. And there is this sense, for example, in the leadership of this transnational Jewish mobilization, that there is a public opinion out there that can actually put pressure on various governments. And it's not just about the power of the purse, but it's also the power of the purse. For example, there's a German Jewish banker in the United States, Jakob Schiff, who personally contributed money, for example, to the Japanese side of the Russo-Japanese War, hoping he would help bring about the end of the Russian monarchy. He tried to organize boycotts of the Russian monarchy in terms of fundraising. The Russian Minister of Finance was very aware of the fact that Jews were a potential source of money. So there is an international scope to sort of purview that everyone is thinking about. But in terms of modernity, my point is they use publicity, they use exposure, they stand up in the courtroom, they have journalists, they want to make an impression. And what's fascinating to me is they do. And they do influence. There is a lobbying, and there's a brand new book about Vinaver by a Russian historian, a wonderful Russian historian, and he uses the word in Russian, lobbyирование, meaning lobbying. So this is a modern idea that you put pressure, you influence opinions, and somehow this helps create institutions that work in your favor, or policies that work in your favor.
Thank you, Laura. Well, thanks to all of you for coming, for attending our last monthly lecture for 2019. As a little thanks from our side, all of you are now invited downstairs to our cafeteria. Have a glass of wine and some cheese with us, continue the conversation with Laura and with all the rest of the people present. The last lecture for 2019, obviously we will continue in 2020. Welcome back for all of that. I think we still didn't fix the date for January, but we will continue. There will be one. So see you all back soon. And for the time in between, I wish to all of us, unfortunately the picture has disappeared, El Lisitsky, I wish to all of us a little bit of the ferocity and of the playfulness of the tiger. Have a good time in between. And you stole my last word, and this is, I think we should have a long and really grateful applause to you, Laura. Thank you so much for this.